write for different types of media, including social media. I mentioned the IT competency, and that tends to be looked at now. So understanding tools, applications, collaborative platform, really important. But also, and this is something that I'm experiencing, professionals who understand beyond the silo of PR itself. So we know a tremendous amount about public relations and what we need to do, but also understanding the marketing realm. Not saying that we want to be marketers, understanding the web and the digital realm. That is a very well-rounded communications professional and someone who is looked at very closely and is needed.
Thank you so much. Well, as I said, it was frightening, but also wonderfully educating. Thank you so much. And now I'll hand over to our next. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Deirdre as well as Anand Raviswamy, for moderating this session. The Q&As, I know you have much more to ask, and if you do, please hold your questions. As always, Deirdre on the social media sites that she mentioned. Now for the next session that we are heading to, it is a session about the art and power of storytelling. Well, you and I, we really need the skill, especially in the world of media that I come from, radio and television. You're no good if you cannot tell a story. In this hall, the good news is that besides our own grandparents, in this hall there are people who can do it and who have done it very well. And I'm going to call these people on the stage. They are very, very good communicators and happen to be best-selling novelists as well. Anita Nair, famous for her work on books like The Better Man, Ladies Coupe, and her latest novel, Cut Like Wood. I'd like to call you on stage. Please welcome Anita Nair. Also, Ashwin Sanghi, known for his works of Chanakya's Chant, The Roosevelt Line, and the latest offering, The Krishna Key. Please join me in welcoming Ashwin Sanghi. This session of storytelling is going to be moderated by Amrita Ganguly Salyan. She likes to call herself a content development and audience engagement professional. So, Amrita, I'd love you to have you moderate this session. Over to you.
How many of you enjoy reading fiction? Like a quick hand up. Alright. And you still do? Yes. Okay, how many of you enjoy reading non-fiction? Percentage falls. Alright. Okay, how many of you follow news regularly? So is that fiction or non-fiction?
Fiction.
Did I get that right?
Most news is fiction. Most news is fiction. How can there be fiction or non-fiction?
So the point being made is that why is there a storytelling session in a PR conference, right? So before we start the discussion, let me at least introduce the reason why I would like to moderate this session. In my 12 years of journalism experience, I perhaps have rejected most PR stories than anybody else in this room. Okay, as editor for photography, luxury, interiors, children, real estate, travel, I have incessantly rejected PR pitches sent to me as editor of those titles. So in that context, the reason I would, like a precursor to the session would be 2 short slides as introduction to explain why me, why them for your conference here, alright? So here are my top 5 tips to impress the editor. Self-explanatory, right? So the 5 reasons where a lot of PR pitches get rejected, and you can understand from my experience that close to 60% of the proposals and stories we get hit a delete button immediately. It's unfortunate because from my side, where I sit, no matter how much heart and soul you have put into your story, we get 400 stories sounding exactly the same. Best in class, excellent, premium, superb. I'm tired of those adjectives, right? So the 5 points here, if you have any doubts, you can ask me. Otherwise, it's just for FYI slide. Is this self-explanatory? Yep. Alright, so these reasons were why we reject a lot of PR stories. Now connecting on to storytelling with the PR application. Again, these few points are the basis of our discussion. When we say storytelling, I am not ascribing to fiction. We have 2 excellent brains for fiction writing here, where we will explore their creative process, not so much the fiction output. So please underline that in your notes. Our PR agenda is fact-driven. Fiction writing is a creative process which we'll try to imbibe into our discussion of understanding how to think creatively. Alright? Again, any doubts in this? Any questions? It's just FYI. Can we proceed now? Yeah. So the brief given to us was we have to basically pin down these 2 great minds here, open their brains, and cull out 3 important questions for our session now. 1, where do the ideas come from? Basic enough. 2nd, how do they decide a structure to the idea that has struck them? And 3rd, the application or the final product, how does it shape up? So these 3 points connect to our PR agenda as well. Is that alright? You need to be slightly more awake to make this a fun session. Is that alright? Yes. Alright. So we start with Anita first. Let's mic over to her to understand her creative process for getting the big idea to begin with. Over to Anita.
Okay, great. How do I get my ideas? I think, as question is also going to probably tell you, that with writers, we do not have the benefit of a brief. It's not like where we are told that, okay, this is what you should be writing about, and there are writers who do that. But writers of fiction have to begin with an idea, and the idea is something that is free-floating. But the idea comes into the mind, and it germinates, and it stays there, and over a period of time, it gathers momentum, and it gathers a shape and texture, and in a matter of days, months, or years, it depends really, the idea eventually becomes something that demands to be written in a certain way. What do you think, Krishna?
On to me? That was quick. Alright, I actually endorse that view, that you have to let it cook to a point where it needs to be written. But let me actually answer this question in the form of a story, because I'd like to actually tell you a little bit about how I got into writing, because that may actually answer this question a little better. Till 7 years ago, I was a businessman. I grew up in a business family, and hadn't written anything longer than 1,000 words. I sat down to write my first novel in 2005, and by the time I was done, I'd written over 110,000 words with that novel. So for me, it was a sudden flash. Call it a flash of inspiration, a sudden flash of enlightenment, although I don't consider myself enlightened. But I think where it came from was the fact that I had been to Srinagar, to Kashmir, after a long time. I used to go there as a child, but I never recalled one particular tomb which I had visited, which was known as Roosevelt. And there was a beautiful popular folklore, almost you could say a myth around that tomb, that the person buried there wasn't a medieval saint from the 14th century, but was actually Jesus Christ. And I don't know what happened. On that particular trip, I was just fascinated with this notion that the person buried there could possibly be Jesus Christ. To the point where I spent the next 11 months reading everything that I could on that particular subject. And that's the cooking process which Anita talked about. In the 12th month, I had devoured about 53 books on that subject. And I reached a point of analysis paralysis. And the writing was actually my only way of being able to get rid of that analysis paralysis. So when I actually got down to write, it was a process of maybe around 6 months or 7 months. But what it told me was that if your idea is strong enough, then it doesn't matter as to whether you have fancy words or sentences. It doesn't matter. The idea will propel you to write. It will propel you to complete that story. And probably if you're excited enough about the idea, your readers will also be equally excited. Probably. And so, to answer your question, that was with the first book, but thereafter I got into the habit of actually maintaining a data bank. So I have an email ID, which is not my usual email ID. It's an email ID which is a private email ID. And whenever for example, if I'm here at Pondicherry and something comes along which says, oh wow, that's an interesting nugget of information. Or if I come across an interesting visual image, which I think could be interesting from the angle of filing away, I take a snap of it on my BlackBerry and I email it to myself. But the long and short of it is that at any given point of time, I would probably have about 10,000 or 12,000 such bits of unrelated information sitting in my inbox, which then becomes the inspiration for future ideas.
So the big idea there. So the big idea then is to work, the first best practice would be to work on your little black book of good ideas. So as and when it occurs to you for a client, for a pitch, for whatever it is that you're wanting to do PR around, so the best practice we note as point number 1 is to keep a black book of good ideas. So like we said, 10,000 for one book. So you can well imagine for the next volume of releases or stories you might be putting out, what kind of idea bank you could be requiring to keep the ratio going. A question I'll direct back to Ashwin again is something he said was the next segment of the discussion about analysis paralysis, what we otherwise would call as also a thought block or a writer's block. So, given Anita and Ashwin both have done their share of prolific writing, we take turns exploring that morning when you need to write and you just can't. All of us been there, right? So let's hear it from them that what do they do when the words just don't flow?
Well, honestly speaking, Amrita, there's nothing that a good shot of whiskey doesn't cure. So that is at least the remedy that I have found for writer's block. I always say that in my life, there were always the 4 W's. I was always a businessman, so I was into work. Then I took up writing as a parallel career, so that was the second W. The third W was my wife, who I love dearly. And finally, the fourth W is whiskey. So, not necessarily in that order. But having said that, I think to a certain extent, writer's block, I don't believe in the concept of writer's block. I find that, in fact, if you simply just be disciplined enough to do something else, because writing is not simply about putting pen to paper. For example, with an average book that I will write, I normally will live with that story for about 18 months. The first 6 or 7 months, because the sort of genre that I write in requires at least a good 6 or 8 months worth of research. So the first 6 or 8 months would go into research. then the next 2 to 3 months is actually the time that I spend in terms of developing my plot. And at that point of time, I have a huge wall in one end of my study where I will have hundreds of post-it notes which pretty much tell me how the plot is going to eventually pan out. And so by the time I actually sit down to start writing, I've gone through a process of maybe around 10 or 11 months of doing background work. Now the point is that very often when you sit down to write, it's very possible that on a given day the words may not flow, but there's probably enough of other stuff that needs to be done along with it. It could be in terms of just simply filing your research notes. It could be in terms of going back and re-reviewing your material. And sometimes when you simply do that again, once again, kickstarts the process and gets your mind into overdrive.
Okay, in my case, I began life as an advertising writer, and I didn't have the luxury of really, coming into work and telling myself that I'm not in the mood to write today, so I can't write whatever I'm expected to write. So inevitably, I ended up never having a writer's block. It became just an inbuilt discipline, and I still, and then when I quit advertising and became a full-time writer, for a few weeks I had this major problem of not knowing how to make the transition, because until then I was always writing, at work. I would do my fiction writing as well at work, and probably not the nicest thing to do, working at your work spot. But it was something that I did, and then suddenly I didn't have a job to go to, and writing was the only thing that I did. My fiction was the only thing I did. So which meant that every morning when I woke up, I had to tell myself that I had to write this for myself, not because anybody else was out there waiting for me to write it. I think in the case of all the PR professionals in this room, you at least, to some extent, have somebody breathing down your neck and asking you, where is that press release? But in our case, at least in my case, I didn't have that, and so it had to come from within. I had to compare myself to, deal with any kind of inertia that would let me believe that, okay, today I don't have to write, I can save for another day, and then one day could become 2 days, and it could become a week, and it could become a month, and time would just go by and nothing would be written. So the other thing that I discovered is that, okay, there are good days of writing and bad days of writing. The thing to do is to believe that it is important to write no matter what, because out of a page of bad writing you can still salvage something, and you can take it ahead and build around it. And the other important thing that I believe has worked wonderfully for me is that when I hit a point when I think my writing isn't happening as smoothly as I would like it to, then what I do is I just put it aside and start reading something else. A good piece of writing. It could just even be a good advertisement, a good long body copy advertisement, and I read that. And sometimes when you see the passion that has gone into the writing, that alone works as a moment, as a trigger that makes me want to go back to my writing and deal with it differently.
Again, good examples of how you can keep the ideas running and the timelines going. The two advantages that they have and most PR professionals in this room don't. One is the luxury of time. We are all deadline driven, so we have that much smaller a window to close the story. And second, the paucity of space. Now, a novel can run into several hundreds of pages, but we are given just a single page to grab the mind space of the intended audience that we are talking to. You send any press release more than one page, maybe a page and a half, you've lost your audience, right? So, balancing these two scenarios, we will now ask our analysts here for the optimal structure of a press release, given their experience in writing lengthy engagement content. So, their content is engagement over several pages, and we get a page or a page and a half. So, what kind of a structuring would work to make it as effective and as engaging as the kind of power fiction writing might have?
Right, again I have to go back to my advertising avatar. one of the first things I was told by when I joined advertising as a copy trainee was that I had this really lovely creative director who said, just believe that every word that you write, you have to pay the client $1. So which means you're going to really make your copy really concise and precise, and there is going to be no superfluity at all. And I think that worked wonderfully for me, because not just in advertising writing, you learn to be pithy, you learn to be precise, you learn to use one word instead of 12 words, you learn to find the right word, essentially. But I saw that this experience actually worked to my benefit and to my advantage when I was writing my fiction. It happened that, I would, eventually to a point that I sometimes think, I edit so much in my mind even before I write, that when I'm writing, I am still quite conscious of that young copy trainee who had been told, you'll have to pay $1 a word for every word that you write. And so this has actually gone on to help me structure my writing as well. So when I, for instance, work on a novel, I mean, I've written various genres of novels. So when I work on whatever genre that I'm working on, I have one cardinal rule, which is that in